Hello and welcome. My name is Angel Pizarro. We're going to be talking about working with secure genomics data and some upcoming policy changes and programs that the NIH has to offer. It's my great pleasure to announce Vivien Bonazzi, who will be speaking in a bit. We've had a little bit of a slide snafu, so we'll start with my portion of the segment. That'll take about 10 minutes, and hopefully by that time the slides will be updated so that Vivian isn't out here doing interpretive dance for her session of the program. So why don't we begin? As I said, my name is Angel Pizarro. I'm part of the scientific computing team here at Amazon Web Services. We do call ourselves the Psychos, which is a pretty fun moniker for ourselves. You can reach me at angel@amazon.com. And today I'm going to be talking about specifically secure genomics analysis on Amazon Web Services, so the compliance portion and the security portion of when you're working with controlled access genomic data. Whenever AWS talks about security, when we talk about what it is, how we think of the world with respect to security and compliance, we always talk about security of the cloud, which AWS has a really good story around. We have very tight security controls around our services and hardened API endpoints. Our physical infrastructure is top-notch security, but then there's also the component of security in the cloud. And what that means is that the customers are responsible for their applications, or what users get on their systems, how they configure their networking and access controls, and other things that they do on top of our platform. So security of the cloud, AWS responsibility. Security in the cloud is a customer responsibility. And to take that home a little bit further is this slide, where on my right, your left, we have what AWS considers its responsibilities and roles. We have very tight security on our storage infrastructure, third-party audits, the ISO certifications out the wazoo. And then you add in a customer and partner solution on top of those foundational services and products and API endpoints. And together with a third-party audit, you create a strong and secure environment, compliant environment that's been fully audited. And we've undertaken some pretty stringent compliant workloads, such as PCI compliance, FISMA moderate workloads, HIPAA compliance, and a new one as of last year is ISO 9001, so GXP certification to develop FDA-approved applications for infrastructure and data services using cloud services. So we're spearheading the efforts there. What this model allows you to do as a customer is refocus your attention on problems that actually matter to your business, as opposed to gatekeeping. How do you access physical underlying infrastructure? How do you get rid of it? Right? Specific to genomic data security, the NIH, through some efforts that Vivian and I were involved in over the past few years, have updated the NIH policy on the use of cloud resources for controlled access research consented data from the NIH. You can view those dbGaP policy changes on the site on the left here. It really boils down to following the recommendations that are in this paper on my left, your right, I believe. I'm a little bit going around here. You can get this white paper here about how to architect and what issues should you look at when you're looking at controlled access and trying to meet these security requirements. But they boil down to this set of requirements from the NIH. One is that you have physical security. You have some plan to be able to restrict access and get rid of physical resources at the end of their life. There's an electronic security section which looks at user account security, access control lists. How do you secure your network? Do you encrypt your data in transit at rest? What are your standard operating procedures for patching software? And then finally, there's a data access security layer, which really deals about data provenance. Have you tracked who had access to the data? When did they have access to the data? Was that access revoked? When it was revoked, did they delete their copies from that project, right? So these are the general areas that are covered by most common sense rules around protecting genomic data. And that 17-page white paper goes over all of these. But today I'm going to focus on two things so that we keep the time short and Vivian can get up here and do her thing, which is around secure networking and encryption of the data in transit at rest. So networking. Amazon has this thing called a service called Virtual Private Cloud, Amazon VPC, where we create a secure network configuration. It allows you to define what the network address space is and what the rules around accessing that network is from a static firewall and a stateful firewall perspective. So to call it out in pictures, imagine this is availability, two availability zones within a region within the AWS infrastructure. I'm assuming that you know a little bit about AWS. You define a VPC, and you'll note that this is a 10.0 network. So you're defining the actual IP address space for this VPC, and this creates a logically segmented region of the AWS infrastructure. So unless folks can route to that IP address space, there is essentially disconnected from the internet. In this design, we're creating a two-zone DMZ private network where the zone on the left, the DMZ, is internet accessible, and the right, it is not. You control the route tables, you control where resources are actually launched into, and you also control whether the VPC itself will allow access to the internet at all by attaching an internet gateway service, which is pretty cool. So in order for anything in a private domain to reach out to the internet, it actually has to go through network address translation layers within the DMZ, and you can do a lot of monitoring and auditing and inspection of the resources there. And finally, I'll say that you don't even have to expose your resources to the internet at all. You can attach a virtual gateway device to create a secure IPsec VPN tunnel. So, and extend your institutional network. So with all of this, I'm pretty sure I can convince any IT security personnel that you're able to provide secure and networking resources within AWS. For data encryption in transit and at rest, right, so the storage layer. You're always free to encrypt data before you send it to AWS, right? If you've got applications within your data center that can work with encrypted data, and you've got the same applications and key management infrastructure within AWS, you're able to work with our products, right? Or, first let me take a step back and talk about encryption and why this is a hard problem and why maybe you might want to shy away from that approach. So encryption primary, you take your PHI data, your symmetric data keys, you encrypt them together, you have encrypted PHI. That solves your data encryption problem. Now, what do you do with the key? How do you protect that key? The answer for most items is actually to encrypt it, right? So you take another master key, you encrypt the master key, and now you can store both the encrypted object data key along with the data object that it encrypts in a secure fashion. You don't lose track of either one. Everybody's happy, but now you have a new problem. What do you do with the master key? Well, of course, you can encrypt it, and you can encrypt that and encrypt that, right? So at some point in this key hierarchy, it's not turtles all the way down. You're going to have some plain text symmetric key PHI somewhere that will allow you to work with the data in a plain text format and make it actually useful. AWS does the right thing. Our storage products do the right thing with respect to encryption, and I'm just going to go a little bit fast here in terms of time, but this is how S3 does server-side encryption with a fully managed AWS key. We take your PHI over an OpenSSL connection or an SSL connection to our S3 web server. We create a symmetric data key that's per object and per account based. We encrypt the data, we encrypt the key, we store those two things together, and we do the right thing with that master key, which means that we do regular rotation of it, we do management to limit the blast radius, and we store it within secure infrastructure. All of this is enabled by something called Amazon AWS Key Management Service. And it's a service that allows you to provision this root level key and data object keys with specific AWS services or available through our SDK. It's available in all the commercial regions. It's actually also available within GovCloud as well. And in a nutshell, it works like this, where a per data service on a per data object level requests from key AMS a data object key. The data gets encrypted, the key gets encrypted and stored along with the bit of data, and then the master key gets stored within the KMS service itself. The benefits of this approach that is it limits blast radius, and and security these days is not really a stop-all infiltration. It's how fast can you react to any given infiltration. And if you limit the blast radius and have a principle of least privilege, you can limit it by a lot, and that's how we operate. And also, having this robust sort of per object data key allows you to manage millions and millions of objects that can be individually encrypted and limited. Thank you. That's the end of my presentation. Hopefully the revised, Clayton, if we can get Vivian's slide, starting from slide 1, if we get the updated slide, she'll get up here. Vivian, why don't you come up and introduce yourself and what your mission is while the slides get.
Do you know if they're there or not?
I'll find out. But
okay.
Let's
Good morning. My job, should I choose to accept it, is to buy us time until my slides turn up. I guess I got the right accent to say that. I'm Vivien Bonazzi. I'm from the NIH, National Institutes of Health, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the structure of the new Associate Director for Data Science Office, which has just been started in NIH over the last year. My role in that is gadget girl and technology specialist. My background is as a computational genomics biologist. I've worked for a variety of industry, like Celera and Tiger, so I was working on the Human Genome Project, and I've also spent quite a bit of time working for the National Human Genome Institute. So my background is both in industry as well as academia, as well as research. And look at that. My job has been successfully achieved. How do I move forward? Big green arrow. Okay, well, I succeeded in introducing myself. All right, so today what I'm going to talk to you about is big data, but in particular how that relates to big data as biomedical big data, how NIH is actually going to see that. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of data that we have. Now, I'm going to assume that some people in the audience have biology backgrounds and some may not, but this is the kind of thing that NIH would have done in the past. A lot of this was written down as text information, and I was pleased to see that the diagrams at the bottom almost match the Washington monuments, but not quite. But my point is that a lot of this was either hands-on, you either touched it like skeletons, or you drew it, or you wrote something down about it and you observed it. That's the nature of what biology did. Or you talked with patients. So we tried to cover that kind of data. As time has gone on, our data has changed. And that data has changed in a number of different ways. We have higher complexity of data, different types of data, and higher volume data. And this is just a representation of those. So we don't just have radiographs, we also have fMRIs, which is the central picture here of the brain. We also do DNA sequencing, which I've shown here on the bottom, and the explosion in terms of genomic technologies, which have reduced the cost to actually do DNA sequencing, means that the amount of data has gone up enormously. Generally, particularly in the academic sector, a lot of attention has been paid specifically to the actual amount of data that you're producing and how much you can actually make that cheaper to generate. But now what we're realizing, when you're generating terabytes of data, you've got a problem. Terabytes is not the same as terabases, and trying to get NIH to understand that has been some of our mission. So, with all of that data, we need more of this. And we started with, I certainly started with Linux clusters. Groups now are across the United States and across the world are looking at larger data centers. And of course, the one on the right here in the picture is NERSC, which is the DOE supercomputing facility out in Berkeley. DOE facilities and the HPC facilities are not that easily accessible to NIH grantees. So what we've found is quite a few of them, as they're starting to transition to looking at very large data sets, particularly genomic, but more than that, digital data in the form of images is also quite large. So people are starting to use the cloud. And what NIH is starting to look at is how do we actually leverage those services for doing the kind of work and the kind of analysis and data that we do with biological data, whatever that is, be it genomic, be it clinical, be it image, etc. And that's what we're actually doing. Problem with this is that we had a whole lot of data, but we really didn't have a digital strategy. And so essentially what we did was grow with what we had without really thinking through the implications of actually how to do that. So to do that, NIH has done a number of things, and what I'm going to speak about in the first part of this talk is how we're actually approaching this at NIH, and then I'm going to speak a little bit more specifically about this concept of the commons, which some of you may have heard about and some not, and I'll talk about those a little bit more in detail. So the thing that NIH does very well is set up working groups. They talk for a long time and they develop very important reports. I would recommend that you read this. It's a very long report, but it really does cover a lot of the issues. It looked at the issues of, we have a lot of data, it's very variable, there's a lot of it in different types. What do we do? This report describes that. The next thing that happened about the same time was the issue of this memo. It was known as the Holdren memo that was issued in 2013. And it's essentially to make digital assets from federally funded research available. NIH has policies for the data must be made open if you are publicly funded by NIH. But this is actually pushing us more into this direction even further. This is a good thing in a lot of people's minds. You have to remember that certainly from the biologist's point of view, the end point of their work is usually a publication. And that publication has turned over time into a PDF, but all of the data that goes behind it and the software can sometimes be lost. And so what this has done is actually looking at upstream of the publication, the data that actually went into that publication, making that available, but also making the software associated with that data available. This touches a whole lot of issues around reproducibility, where do you store that data, how do you make use of it, etc., and that's what we're tackling at the moment. But this memo has essentially helped us have somewhat of a stick to be able to move us forward in this area. So how are we actually doing this? NIH and other federal agencies are working to make these digital assets much more available. Don't go to this link, like a good government link. It actually links to nothing. It's an old link, but if you do look for this memo, you will actually find it by the name. It applies to all publications and digital scientific data, etc., and we are in the process of developing a strategy for that. So, just in summary, what we had was a report done by a bunch of very interesting, important people around the country that have a really strong background in bioinformatics, computing and biology, and clinical and biomedical research areas. They wrote the report, the memo came out. So what was our response? So we did two things. One was to establish the new Data Science and Research and Training Program, which is known as BD2K, or Big Data to Knowledge. That link is live, and you can go to that, which will give you an example of what we're doing in BD2K. It is a collection of things, and it essentially addresses the issues in the report that I showed you before, that you can also find online. What was also done was to establish a new position, and this is the new Associate Director for Data Science, and this is Phil Bourne, and he started in March 2014, and he is the head of our unit. So we were thinking about how we address this memo that I mentioned before, and also the document that was written. How do we actually translate that? The BD2K program is part of it, but we were thinking about this also in a more holistic fashion. And I'm going to go through a little bit and explain that and where our strategy for the ADS office is, ADS being the Associate Director for Data Science Office. That's our current term for our name. So I think what we all realized is the nature of science is evolving, and it must turn into a digital enterprise. We all know that, and as I mentioned before, this is something that's taken us a while at NIH to do that, but we definitely needed a strategy rather than ad hoc responses. And we obviously need to do it by doing this through a digital enterprise that forms some form of ecosystem. So our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to use data science to foster an open digital ecosystem that will accelerate efficient and cost-effective biomedical research. This is important in the area of flat budgets. We have to be cost efficient. I think all of you who've dealt with large data sets know that it's not free. It costs money to maintain this. It's really important to figure that out. And we have been struggling with this at NIH to figure out how do you pay for it, what should you do, where should you store it, and what does it mean? And as always, NIH must have enhanced health, lengthen life, reduce illness and disability, and go where no woman or man has gone before. All right, our ad strategy. What we've been talking about over the last couple of months is evolving. What are the areas that we want to focus? The Big Data to Knowledge program is part of this, but we're actually looking at this more holistically. The ads office is situated in the main building of NIH with Francis Collins, which I think is an indication of how important Francis Collins, who is the director of NIH, thinks that we should be addressing these kinds of issues. What we're trying to do is trans-NIH. There are 27 different institutes at NIH that are very large, and I think it's really important that we actually provide some stewardship around this without removing any of what those institutes are doing themselves, but to actually work with them synergistically. The BD2K program is exactly that. We work across all the different institutes. Here, what we're actually talking about is several areas that we're looking at. Discovery and innovation, which is those things that actually enable that major discovery. This covers things like software, methods, new tools that deal with actually analytics. The workforce development, it's critical that we have scientists that are trained in more data science techniques, that we can also attract people with data science techniques to work more in the biological field, which is really important, and also to educate the NIH staff more along these lines. There are excellent biologists and clinicians at NIH, but knowledge of computer science is one of those things that many had not been trained in. What we're finding is the next generation of scientists that are coming through are naturally more attuned to computing, and the request for this is getting higher. Our job is to improve that training, to reach out to the community to do as best a job as we can so that we improve that knowledge and we can move it to the next step. Too frequently, computing has been one of those things that got left behind simply because of that fact. Policy and process. Angel talked about this a little bit in a moment. There are many policies that we do at NIH, a lot of the things we do, particularly about data policies. Angel spoke about dbGaP. Do most people in this room know what dbGaP is? Can I get a show of hands? I'm getting nods, okay. So it's the database of phenotypes and genotypes which is housed at the NCBI. This is an example where policy and technology came together, and myself and the cloud providers, Angel, and policy people at NIH worked closely together for quite a long time to get the policy changed. And it's not as policy, it's actually a position statement, just to be clear. The goal behind that is because, as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, we have a lot of data. You have to get it out there. People were using dbGaP data and wanted to compare that and use it in the context of their large genomic data, and they couldn't do it locally because they didn't have enough compute resources, and so they wanted to move it to the cloud, but the policies didn't permit the use of this, so what we did was we figured out how to put those pieces together, and that policy now permits you to take approved data, you have to have authorization to do it, to move it to the cloud of your choice, and be able to do the analysis for the period of time that you have access to that data during your experimental processes. That's a big step forward from what I've seen from the community. We've got a lot of really good positive press, which was really great. And the point of what we're going to do here is there'll be other policies that will follow through here where I think we're going to be addressing those issues. Obviously, right now it's slices of dbGaP data. We have to look at, could you potentially house more than that? In particular, dbGaP data, like all protected human access data, has got protections associated to it, obviously for privacy and protection of that data. We have many of those data sets at NIH, but many people want to use these in large compute environments, and so our policies and procedures will be looking at how do we do that in a way that's actually really efficient, effective, and useful for the community. Leadership. In this area, it's really important that we talk about some of the technologies and how they apply to biomedical science. And that's strongly my job, which is how do we look at some of these technologies and translate it into such a way that makes real sense to the biologists who don't do this on a daily basis, to help them understand how it does make a difference to what they're doing and why. It isn't just the cloud as the infrastructure, it's also the tools that run over the top of that, the service, the analytics, etc. And so our job is to really be able to lead that at NIH and say, if you need help doing that, that's important. For example, if you're going to use the cloud, what does that mean for your data? What are the issues in terms of storing it, using it, etc.? But how do you also use tools like MapReduce or Hadoop? What does that mean? Those words don't mean a lot to a lot of people at NIH. And our job is to be able to translate that so they can actually understand it and be able to use it in their environments. Sustainability. This is the one I'm actually going to spend the rest of my talk discussing, if it actually moves. No? Clearly it's sustainable. All right, sustainability. The idea here is to foster a sustainable, efficient, and productive data science ecosystem known as the Commons. Let's just be clear here about what we mean by sustainable, and this is really how Phil Bourne, I think, sees it. We provide a lot of money for grants for people to do biomedical research. They produce a lot of artifacts from that research. A lot of that now is digital data, be it software, data from their actual experiments, etc. But often that gets lost. You can't find it again. It's somewhere. Again, the currency is the publication rather than all the rest of the pieces that go into doing what you do. And so sustainability to us is a couple of different things. It's how do you sustain that data which you have actually supported through grants in the longer term? How can it be found and reused in such a way by other people in a way that's meaningful? Sustainability obviously also talks about the budgets associated to this. How do we do that in a flat climate? We all know that that's the case, and NIH has certainly been under those auspices for the last several years. So the range of my talk is going to be looking at the commons. So what is it? It's what I've been getting at, which is it treats products of research, which are the data, the methods, the papers, anything that's produced, as some form of digital object, and that these digital objects can exist in a shared virtual space. That these objects also follow these principles, that they follow the principles of FAIR, which is findable, accessible, which I also mean usable. If you can find it but you can't use it, so what? They have to be interoperable and they have to be reusable. If you do that, and we fund all of this research and apply these FAIR principles to this, we have a much better chance of reusing the information, finding it and making sense out of that, rather than simply looking at just the publication and ignoring the rest of the story. So, this virtual space, what we'd like scientists to do is to be able to find, deposit, manage, share, reuse that data. This also leads to reproducibility of results, and if you have the ecosystem set up right, one of the things we're really interested in looking at, how do you make things reproducible? And really importantly, we want this to be an environment to find and catalyze the use of these objects and to be able to share with other researchers. That's really critical. So the components of the commons. For those of you interested, there are documents up at the ADDS website that will have this. Myself and George Komatsoulis, who's a colleague of mine at NCBI, have been putting these together, which have a fairly long written document about this. And very soon we're going to release a longer document that goes into more detail around a lot of the issues around here for the commons. So if this is a real virtual space, what do we do with it? How do we actually make that happen? And this is what we've been working on for the last 6 to 9 months. So what I'm going to talk about now is the components, and then I'm going to give you some examples of what we're doing with it. So the compute environment, it's pretty critical. And we're going to look at either cloud or HPC. Obviously it supports access, utilization, sharing, and storage of objects. It's the fundamental piece of what we actually need. And obviously there's been discussions with all the cloud providers and also HPC groups. Oops, oh, I can't go back, right? Then I'll speak to this slide. Oh, I can go back, perfect. Methods for interoperability. If you can put data somewhere, you need to be able to do something with it, and it's really critical that you have that ability to do something with it. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean by that, but in this case we essentially mean APIs and things like containers like Docker. The digital compliance model. If you have a place to put your data and you have APIs for it, well, you can end up getting a very large mess if you don't end up having some compliance around that. So this means things like ensuring that there are some ways to make the properties of those digital objects consistent and so that it enables them to be discoverable. And lastly is indexing. If you do all of that, you still have to be able to find it. This is just a picture that I've been working on. I'm about to update this, but this is just an example of diagrammatically what I just said in words. And now I'm going to just describe a little bit about each one of those components. Hopefully. Okay, the compute environment. The cloud's an obvious one. I think you're all at this conference. You know what this is. I don't need to go through the details of it. In particular for NIH, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this talk, we have a lot of data which is simply increasing. And so the real advantage of something like the cloud is the fact that you can store a large data set on it and you've got the co-location of your data and tools and you can achieve what you need to do, which is analysis. The fact that it's scalable and elastic, you can spin it up, spin it down. You pay what you use. A lot of NIH researchers use spot instances on AWS. It's cheaper to do it that way, but you can choose what you want to do. So the menu is there, you pay for what you use, and you pay for what you can use. It's also a very useful environment for fostering collaboration. The other point I want to make, which I mentioned before, but I think it's worth stating again, our experience at NIH is that many people go to the cloud providers simply because the way that the government agencies are structured is it's not very easy for us to work with DOE and NSF to get access to their resources. They have mostly HPC in the supercompute centres, although that's changing. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of NIH is going to the cloud at the moment. The usual suspects, the folks that we've been talking to at the moment, but there's also an increase in private clouds, I guess. In particular, one's focusing on slightly different aspects. For example, the iDash cloud with Lucella Ono Machado looks at particularly the issue of HIPAA compliance and human subjects, and looking at how you would store that in those particular environments. The Broad, but all of the many of the large sequencing centres around the country also have very large compute facilities that are setting up things like OpenStack on them to have a combination of mixed environments as well. So what we're seeing is a trend in the research environment to actually have small clouds which either are standalone and or have hybrid connections out to public clouds. As I mentioned before, the HPC centres, the other things that we've been looking at ourselves, these are just a list of some of those, but it's not comprehensive. As I mentioned before, NIHs don't have as easy access to this as the cloud simply because of the agreements within the agencies have not been set. There's been a tremendous amount of work being done over the last couple of months between NSF and now with DOE to try and figure out how do we foster these relationships to get to the place where we could potentially use these. Lastly, one of the plus sides of HPC is the optimized environment, which is often set up by very specialized people that have a very strong knowledge of their system. And increasingly, a lot of the supercompute centers also have a lot of bioinformatics folks that can translate between IT and biology. For a lot of NIHs, that's really good. A small percentage of NIH researchers have the right background to be able to handle the compute systems. So that's actually a big plus and advantage here than if they go straight to the cloud where they know nothing and they have to learn from scratch and essentially have to have people help them. All right, let me talk a little bit about the interoperability. I mentioned this before. The key things that we're noting that are really taking off at the moment for us is to allow the kind of connectivity that we need. People are using APIs primarily, and they use them for two things. One is to expose the data, and so they can provide direct access to it, and the other one is to enable that data to be passed to tools or pipelines for analysis. They're the two major things we're seeing. The other thing that we're seeing is obviously containers, primarily Docker, but I would imagine there'll be others. And the idea behind that, as I'm sure you know, is basically those Docker containers can be inserted in the cloud and people can be using them. There are all sorts of people now looking at developing these Docker containers, and we're now starting to get a plethora of those. And so one of the things we're clearly looking at is how do you aggregate these fairly clearly for certain projects, and how do you make them easily findable? So if you have a Docker container or an API, what you want is some level of standardization to that also has metadata associated to it so I can actually find it when I'm looking at the indexing component of this. Digital compliance. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you don't have some form of digital compliance for your objects, then the problem is you can have a mess. And essentially what we're looking at for first phase in the commons is they have unique identifiers of some sort and a minimal set of searchable metadata, that they're physically available in the cloud. I think they have clear access rules for access, particularly if it's got human subjects associated to it, and it's got an entry for an index for the indexing purposes. That's what we think will be initial phases, but as we move forward, what we're looking at is using metadata standards which are driven by the community, not by us. We want to be able to also look at the right standards around the APIs. There's been a lot of discussion around having RESTful interfaces and JSON compliance so that we actually have APIs that we can reuse and are not simply written in a format that no one can reuse. That has happened in the past. And I think in the future we would expect things to not necessarily all be physically located in a cloud. They could be done in other places. So what does this look like from a PI's perspective? If I draw this as a picture, let's see if the animation will work. So what we expect to see is a cloud provider of choice, and a PI would be able to access that. You would have, if a PI means principal investigator or researcher. If they want to put objects into the commons, they'd have to be digitally compliant, have digital object compliance. They'd have some sort of interoperability software, APIs or Docker containers, whatever they want in there. And we would develop some indexing software, which we have a group which is working with us through the BD2K program that will provide indexes. So that's what the Commons is at the moment. It's essentially a shared environment which has got a compute platform, some ways of looking at interoperability, and ways of making sure that when you put objects inside it, there's compliance, and then there's a way to actually index it. So I'm going to look a little bit now at some of the pilots, and I'm only going to just give you a couple of examples because they're fairly early on for some of them. We want to evaluate the framework that I've just described to you, which does it make sense? Can you actually do that? And how do we put all the pieces together? What have we missed? What's working? And where should we be going? And so what now we have is NIH funds a lot of large data resources, biomedical resources, for both data and tools, and we've been working with a number of those from NIH, and also from groups from the Big Data to Knowledge, the BD2K groups, and we're looking at any and all of the aspects that I've described for the Commons and how they would work within the context of this to be able to test it. We've also been working for the last probably about 12, 18 months with the Human Microbiome Project. The HMP is genomic data, and it's quite large. It's in the order of 20 terabytes at the moment. And the problem was with it, again, you can't compute against it. You can't well, I guess you could download 20 terabytes, but very few people can actually do that and actually do the analysis. So we worked with Amazon to actually make those data and the tools from that project available, and I've just given you a link here to where the data is at the moment. That project is ongoing, and we hope to make additions to that. There's additional data to it and also tools. And again, it's essentially data in the cloud with a whole lot of objects that are compliant and fit within the Commons principles. So we're using this as an example to also test that. Keep in mind, all of this data will be publicly available to people, so you'll be able to go there, use it, and use those tools. And the last one is the NCI Cloud Pilot. The National Cancer Institute has a collection of cloud pilots and genomic data commons. They're using a collection of clouds, and they're essentially testing the Cancer Genome Atlas data, TCGA data, in these environments, and they're trying to do a bunch of analyses on genomes looking for variant analysis. I won't go into much more detail than that. And the last one is the cloud credit model. So the first ones are essentially, if you were to use the Commons model, does it actually work? And does it work and translate into the way that biomedical research is done? That's the first piece. The second part is, how do you access the cloud? Many researchers right now, the way they do it is through their credit cards, either private personal ones or through their own procurement systems within the universities. That has proven to be somewhat difficult over time, and so what we'd like to do is to be able to translate this so that if researchers choose to use the cloud, what's an easy way for them to do that in a straightforward manner? And so we've been working on the cloud credits model, also known as the business model, and I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague George Komatsoulis at NCBI, who's been doing a lot of this work. So this is just a slide that will give you a rough idea what we want to do, and it's essentially using a credits type model. So it's the same pictures I showed you before, which is you could choose your cloud provider, and what we do is we provide you a series of credits. You ask us for how much you need, we translate it into credits, and you can use those credits in the Commons. We are going to use, in the left-hand corner, it's actually NIH. I didn't come out with the white text. But essentially, we will be using, NIH will issue credits. We're likely to use a reseller to do this. I can't go into too many more details because those things have not been settled yet and they're not public. But essentially what you'll do is you'll get some credits which you can then use in the cloud, and what we'd hope to do over time is that if you have a grant with NIH, you could ask for credits within your grant to be able to do the work you want, translate those credits into the cloud, and be able to do that. What we'd also want to do is to make sure that you can do everything I showed you before, which is you can index it, etc. For the purposes of the cloud pilots at the moment that I mentioned before in the previous slide, which are tests of this, we're going to be doing some direct buys of the cloud resources because we haven't set up this at the moment, but we're just about to kick this off, and we're hoping to be able to test this over the next 12 months to see if this will actually work. If it does, our hope is that an NIH will be able to take their grant, request some cloud credits, use those in whatever provider they want, and the cloud providers also are requiring, there's a certain level of compliance that they need to do to be able to be part of this system. The advantage here is that you as a researcher, if you want to use the cloud, can. You don't have to. That's the key. You can choose whatever you want. Our also hope is that it will do a number of different things. We think it could be cost effective, and I say we think, we don't know yet. You only pay for what you're using. Right now, within grants within NIH, when you buy something, you often have a large chunk of your grant devoted to some computing. And it's certainly been my experience and others at NIH that that's taking an increasing amount out of their research dollars. It's going to drive competition. We expect to have a collection of cloud providers working here. You're going to be able to share the information. Another really important point is the metrics. We really don't have a very good idea of how much data we have, where it is, etc. And what we want to know is that. What are people using? How often? Why? How are they likely to use it? This isn't so much peering into each one's private data, but looking at how is data being used and what's the right system to support researchers doing the research in the 21st century using digital technologies. And there's been long discussions with the providers, as I mentioned, AWS, Google, Microsoft, IBM, all the major providers. And I think NIH is looking increasingly at what are the right private-public partnerships to do in the right environments. On the downside, it's never been tried before, so we really don't know how it's going to work. Cost models, it's predicated on the prices of the providers. It's whether the providers themselves are willing to be compliant with the system we're trying to put in place. And the other thing is it's pay as you go, which means it'll stop paying, you'll stop paying and it'll stop going. So if that's the case and you don't pay for it anymore, does it simply go away? We don't know. We do know that if we use this kind of approach, it's going to allow us to test the right sort of digital environments with the right compliance models to allow researchers to really start using digital objects in this kind of environment. And I think that's the end of my talk. Yes, I'd like to just again call out George Komatsoulis, who's from NCBI, who's been doing a lot of the work on the credits model. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you for your attention.
Have a microphone in the back.
Can you hear me?
If anybody has a question, please raise your hand.
Okay, so you talked about the shared responsibility for security.
Yeah.
All right, and you have a lot of sensitive data in the cloud. What happens when a bad guy attacks either one of us? How do I find out from you what's going on? How do you find out from me what's going on so that we can coordinate and provide a response?
So AWS does do a lot of inspection of attacks and for instance, denial of service attacks. This isn't the right forum to have that discussion. If you visit our security booth, there's some really fantastic security essays that will walk you through the process about how that goes back and forth. Obviously, with protected health information, it gets a little bit more involved with respect to the law. And again, there are security essays that can help you with your specific questions in the room back there. We had another question in the back.
Just a very geeky question. Since you're using human research subject data, are they being informed that their personal medical information or their genomic information could be loaded into the cloud?
It's whatever's part of their consents. We don't do anything that's not part of the consent.
Because in the past, they've always been told, at least when I did this, was that that all the genomic analysis was going to be blinded. So I don't know why you would be loading personal medical information up into the cloud to do huge data crunching on it.
Well, why are you asking why you would want to do that?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm asking why isn't it blinded before it's ever loaded into the cloud?
Because when you do a large genomic study, right, and you've got multiple terabytes of data, for those who are familiar, the 1,000 Genomes Project is one of those, you're looking at 7. You want to compare that against other studies that have been involved. dbGaP holds some of those, and you want to do some comparisons of those. You could do it outside the cloud if you had the compute capacity. All we're trying to do is provide you only access to the dbGaP studies that you've requested that you would be permitted to use if you're given the authorization by NIH. So you're not asking for anything different, but you're also being asked to make sure that if you're going to use the cloud, we're also asking you to make sure that you are also responsible and on the hook for ensuring that that data is not going to be used in inappropriate fashions. So it's the same as if you were doing it locally on your local service.
Yeah.
But
And I
you
think-
definitely want to do that.
I think that's the correct point here, is that the access to the data is still controlled by
NIH.
research boards, right? Institutional research boards. And the data is already pre-consented to go on some platform to be analyzed. It's not an issue of whether it's genomic data from a human subject or not. It's really how it was consented in the first place, and did it go through a review process for access to the researcher. And it is the same whether it's a HPC center or whether it's AWS. There are a set of controls that you have to meet in order to work with that data. That's really what it boils down to. Any other questions? I think we're done here. One more question right here.
So you mentioned using a lot of APIs, and you also talked about wanting to move from more like Lego.
I can't quite hear you.
Oh, sorry. You mentioned using APIs, and also you said something about wanting to move to more RESTful web services that would be consumable by more modern applications. What are you using today in terms of like API management and that sort of thing?
Are you talking about API management actually in construction and or development of the API and or its storage and where it resides? Or all
More
of
like
the above?
security and policies around the APIs?
We don't, and that's what we're trying to do. The way that a lot of NIH researchers do is they develop the API based on what they're looking at for the data, but they don't think about all those issues. There is several projects undergoing at the moment that are looking at, especially the ones that deal with human subjects data, which is how do you handle encrypted data within the API to do that? And what is the basic protocol for doing that? And we're starting to address those issues as well. But your point is, I think, we don't have them and we need them, and that's part of what we want to do here. People focus on the biology and the clinical work, which is important, but you need the rest of it behind it to be able to make it reusable and also secure, and we're working on that at the moment.
Yeah, and I'll also add that we do a lot of work with the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, who are developing specifically APIs for genomic access data, as well as the security controls around those APIs. That's work in development, so if you're interested in that subject, it's a completely volunteer organization. There's a data working group and a security working group that are working on those issues. Go to genomicsandhealth.org and you'll read more about the Global Alliance.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
you very
Please
much.
fill out the surveys. Thank our speaker, Vivian. It was
Thanks a lot.
great. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, guys.